thank you very much to Barry, to Dr. Chandaria, and to the Institute of Philosophy more generally for inviting me to give these lectures. It truly is an honour. Let's put a feedback there. The lectures will be addressing a really quite simple question, which is, why do we humans lead such peculiar lives? Our closest living relatives, chimpanzees, build nests, and they lead fairly interesting social lives. For example, they form alliances by mutual grooming. They use simple tools. They use stones to crack open nuts, and they use twigs to fish for termites. But I think
this microphone is
But our lives are a good deal more complex, more varied, and more colourful than theirs are. So we are much more dependent on cooperation for survival. We have, for good or ill, much more radically changed our environments than any other animals, and only we have developed the edifices, physical and conceptual, of knowledge and skill, which are technology, agriculture, science, religion, law, trade, politics, music, fine art, and sport. All of these things are distinctively human. Now, people who are interested in the evolutionary origins of the human condition, of our peculiar lives, tend to have one of four foci. They focus on bodies, behavior, brains, or minds. So, key features of our bodies are the fact that we walk on two legs rather than four, that we have remarkable manual dexterity. Key features of our behavior are our tool use, our intense sociality, our control of fire, and research on our brains tends to focus on their size relative to our bodies, or the size of frontal areas relative to the rest of the brain. And of course, all of these four dimensions are intimately interrelated with one another. The mind is implemented in the brain, the mind-brain produces behavior, and behavior is enacted by the body. So a full answer to the question of why we lead such peculiar lives is going to require engagement with all four of these things. But like many cognitive scientists and philosophers of cognitive science, I am particularly interested in the evolution of the human mind, in the evolution of the software that runs on the brain. And so what is that? What is, I'm trying to explain here, what is distinctive about human cognition? What are the cognitive mechanisms which we have and which are either totally absent in other animals or which are present in other animals only in some nascent form? Now, the first one that springs to mind is language. We all tend to have a great reverence for language, the fact that we can talk to one another and other animals can't. That's often seen as a kind of a Rubicon, which once humans crossed it, we went from being like beasts to being like gods. But there are plenty of other candidates for distinctively human cognitive mechanisms. For example, what's now called mental time travel. The capacity to remember particular incidents in particular episodes in the past, like when Princess Diana died, or when I dropped my car keys down a storm drain, and to project ourselves into the future, to think about what one needs for a trek tomorrow, or how one might handle a difficult meeting later in the day. Imitation, our capacity to imitate the fine details of others' body movements. In relatively inconsequential cases, well, they may be consequential to some, exactly how to place one's feet for a golf swing, or exactly how to configure one's body to curtsy on a grand occasion. Causal cognition. We can conceive of the possibility that interactions between physical objects, like a line of dominoes collapsing, are due to hidden causes which are governed by general principles. Mind reading or theory of mind. We don't see ourselves and others as mere automata. We ascribe thoughts and feelings to ourselves and to others and use those ascriptions to predict behavior. Moral reasoning. We have processes which enable us to categorize some actions as right and others as wrong. To think, I should give more to charity, I should not disclose the confidences of my friends. And there are plenty of other candidates. Social exchange reasoning. We may be the only animals that can think about what others ought to do by virtue of a social contract that we are in with them. To weigh up who we should trust when gathering information from others, perform most mathematical operations. Mental mapping. We may be the only animals who can conceive of or represent space and the objects in it from an aerial view in Cartesian coordinates. And metacognition, my final example, although this isn't an exhaustive list. Metacognition, we are able to ask ourselves how well our cognitive processes are doing, how well they are representing the world. Now, you will sometimes find people speaking about each of these cognitive mechanisms as if it was the one secret of our success, the one thing that enables us to lead such peculiar lives. But of course, in truth, it's likely that they all contribute. A more interesting and very contentious question is where these distinctively human cognitive mechanisms come from, how they were made. Now, about 25 years ago now, a group of people, including Steven Pinker, a former Chandaria lecturer, and Leda Cosmides and John Tubey and a number of their colleagues, got together and did something very important, which was to put together evolutionary thinking and cognitive science for the first time. And they presented a view of these distinctively human cognitive mechanisms as being essentially in the genes. They come from genetic evolution. They are made by the genes. They are, to use Steven Pinker's terms, cognitive instincts. So the idea is that each of us is born with a program for the development of theory of mind, a program for the development of language for each of the distinctively human cognitive mechanisms. And that program unfolds in the course of development. Now, the experience that we have in the course of development contributes, but it contributes, it has a triggering function, or it evokes the development of the program for the distinctively human cognitive mechanism. And this cognitive instinct view portrays these mechanisms as being adaptations for a lost world. They evolved sometime in the Stone Age when people lived very different lives than the lives that we live now, or that most of us live now, where they made a living by hunting animals and by gathering plants. And 25 years ago, when this cognitive instinct view of the evolution of human cognition was hatched, there was quite a lot of evidence in support of it. It's entirely understandable that smart, reasonable people thought this was the right picture of the evolution of the human mind. But in the ensuing period, lots of discoveries have been made which make that picture nowhere near as compelling as it used to be. And in the next lecture, I'll be looking in some detail at some of that evidence, but just a preliminary glimpse. Let's consider some of the evidence which provided the foundation for evolutionary psychology for the cognitive instinct view. This was research which was purported to show that we have a module or cognitive instinct for social exchange or social contract reasoning. These were very striking experiments by Leila Cosmides and John Tooby, which used Wayson's four-card problem. And what these experiments showed was that people are much better at solving these conditional reasoning problems when the problem is couched in terms of a social exchange or a social contract than when it's couched in an abstract way. So, for example, if people are given the task, there 4 cards are laid on the table in front of them, one with an E on it, a K, a 4, a 7, and they're asked, which cards would you have to turn over in order to check the rule? If there's a vowel on one side of a card, then there will be an even number on the other side of the card. I won't embarrass you by asking you to put your hands up for various answers. But what's found when this is done in this abstract form is that nearly everybody recognizes that you need to turn over the E card, the card with a vowel on it. But many fewer people, fewer than 50%, recognize that you also have to turn over the card with the odd number on it to check that it does not have a vowel on the other side. But if you present logically the same problem, but couched in terms of drinking and age, so you ask people to check the rule, if a person is drinking alcohol, they should be over 18, and on the cards there is beer, Coca-Cola, over 18, under 18, many, many more people get it right. So this was thought to indicate we have a special cognitive process which is there for cheater detection, or checking whether people are taking a benefit without paying an appropriate social cost. But subsequent research has confirmed that subjects are better on these problems when the problem is couched in relation to other people. It's made into a kind of a person assessment problem than when it is couched in an abstract way. But they are not especially good when the problem is couched in terms of a social contract. So, for example, a prudential rule like if a gun is in the house, then it should be unloaded, produces just as good performance as a social contract version like the alcohol and age version. And people being better when the problem is couched in terms of the actions of others could be just to do with motivation and practice. We get lots of practice at dealing with conditional problems like that. So, if the cognitive instinct view of the evolution of the human mind is looking on the basis of evidence like that, much less compelling than it used to, what should we do? One possibility is pull cognitive science out of evolutionary thinking, reverse what the evolutionary psychologists did, take it out of the federation of subjects, including all of the biological sciences and increasingly economics, which have evolutionary thinking at their heart. But I think there's an alternative. I'm a Remainer. I think we can keep cognitive science in the Federation of Disciplines, which use Darwin's insights, that use evolutionary theory, if we shift our focus to some degree from genetic evolution to cultural evolution. If we recognize that distinctively human cognitive mechanisms are not cognitive instincts, but cognitive gadgets. Now, I'll explain later why I use the term gadget, but the central idea here is that distinctively human cognitive mechanisms are built from old parts provided by genetic evolution in the course of childhood development, predominantly through social interaction. And insofar as they are adaptive, insofar as they do their jobs well, it is due to a cultural selection process. So I'm suggesting that distinctively human cognitive mechanisms are a bit like some of the pieces of simple technology, like canoes, traps, bows and arrows, spinning wheels. Those pieces of technology don't do their jobs well due to genetic evolution, and they don't do their jobs well, or at least not primarily, because any one or collection of smart people sat down and thought, let's design a canoe, and with some knowledge of hydrodynamics, for example, planned exactly what features it should have in order to move fast and avoid sinking. They're not products of that kind of invention. Instead, something like a good canoe is a product of a great many bad canoes. So people have produced a whole bunch of different canoes with different properties. Those that moved fast through the water and that didn't sink were more likely to be around, to be copied, when more canoes had to be made. So, in effect, the environment selected the good canoes from the bad ones. And that's why canoes now have the good adaptive design that they do. It wasn't human foresight, it wasn't genetic evolution. And I'm proposing that that's also true of the bits of technology in our heads, the software that runs on our brains that we have and other animals don't. It's been shaped by cultural selection. So take, for example, theory of mind. The picture there is that each of us acquires a theory of mind, a way of thinking about the thoughts and feelings of ourselves and others in the course of development, primarily through conversation with adults. We are taught about the mind. Historically, different social groups came up with different theories of mind, and the ones that persist in the world today are the theories of mind which were held by relatively successful groups. Groups that had lots of babies, that attracted lots of immigrants, that were copied by lots of other groups, in part because they had theories of mind that did their jobs well, that were effective in predicting behavior. So that's the overall picture. Now, if you think it's far-fetched, reflect on the example of literacy, or reading, the capacity to read. We know that there are parts of the brain which are specialized for reading. So, for example, there's an area which is so reliably active when literate people are presented with printed words that it's known as the visual word form area. We also know from a great deal of behavioral experiments and studies of people with brain damage and therefore difficulty in reading that there's an elaborate set of processes which enable us to read, that enable us to look at some print and say it out loud, as well as deriving meaning from that print. The details here don't matter at all. It's just to give you some idea of the complexity of the software which enables us to read. But we also know that the capacity to read is not in our genes. It's not genetically inherited. It's a cognitive gadget. It's something that we're instructed to do. We know that because the earliest print is only about 5,000 or 6,000 years old. There hasn't been long enough for genetic evolution to give us this hardware and software specialized for reading. So reading is a kind of a proof of principle. It shows that distinctively human, complex cognitive processes can be cognitive gadgets. The question is, how many of them actually are? And my hunch is that it's most, if not all, distinctively human cognitive mechanisms which are gadgets. But I won't, in the course of these lectures, try to persuade you of that. To persuade you of that, I would need to look at each of the distinctively human cognitive mechanisms. I would have to examine the research from comparative psychology, looking at non-human animals, from developmental psychology, looking at the development through infancy and childhood of humans, the many experiments relating to distinctively human cognition from experimental psychology and cognitive neuroscience. And I've only done that for a handful of cognitive mechanisms, distinctively human cognitive mechanisms, and even in those cases, not all the data are in. There's a great deal more to be done to test this cognitive gadget theory. But what I would like to do in the course of these lectures is to persuade you that it's a worthwhile direction to pursue, that it's the right way to develop evolutionary psychology, an appropriate framework for research on the evolution and development of distinctively human cognition, which is now more consistent with the evidence from cognitive science than old-style cognitive instinct, it's in our genes, evolutionary psychology. So here's the titles of the 3 lectures. I'm introducing you to the questions in this one, and shortly I'll be looking at our genetic starter kit. Next time I'll be taking a close look at 2 particular cognitive gadgets, one for mind reading or theory of mind, that enables us to ascribe mental states to ourselves and others and thereby to predict behavior, and one for imitation, which enables us to copy the fine details of body movements, gestures, and object-directed movements. And in the last, I'll be taking a step back and asking about the extent to which this cognitive gadgets view is evolutionary in the Darwinian sense, whether it's consistent with what we know about human prehistory, and what it implies about human nature. Now, as Barry said in his very nice introduction, but he didn't quite put it this way, I am neither fish nor fowl. I am neither a pure in-flight philosopher, nor a deep-sea fish looking all the time at the data and collecting it. My work lies somewhere in between those two, and this lecture is pretty close to the center. You'll see when you get the last bit, as well, you'll see where it's pretty close to the center between the empirically minded and the highfalutin foundational issues. The next one will be moving closer to the data, and the last one will be moving back towards those conceptual or foundational issues. But it's all in this space between psychological fish and philosophical fowl. So, much of what I'll be saying in the course of these lectures is saying it's not in our genes, you know. This thing is culturally evolved. We acquire it through social interaction in the course of development. But before I go on to do that, I want to say what I think is in our genetic starter kit. the genetic differences between us and other animals that provide a foundation for the development and the cultural evolution of cognitive gadgets. So it's not that I imagine that a newborn chimpanzee and a newborn human have exactly the same psychologically relevant genes. I don't think we are blank slates in that sense. Rather, I think that genetic evolution has tweaked the human mind in small but very important ways. Now, I use the term tweaked because I think that in terms of what's genetically programmed in humans, our minds are quantitatively, not qualitatively different from those of other animals. And that those quantitative differences nudge rather than program the development of distinctively human cognitive mechanisms like theory of mind and imitation. So more specifically, I think that genetic evolution has, in the course of human evolution, tinkered with our temperaments, with our attentional biases, and with some general purpose cognitive mechanisms. Slightly more specifically, I think that it has made us more socially tolerant and more sensitive to social rewards than our ancestors. It has made us from birth attentive to faces and voices, and that it has expanded our capacity for associative learning and for several executive functions. So let me say a little bit more about each of those in turn. Temperament. Compared with chimpanzees, we, and especially adult male humans, are much more socially tolerant, much less aggressive to conspecifics, to other members of our species. And, of course, that could be because of socialization. In principle, it could just be that we learn to be tolerant of others. But there is actually quite a lot of evidence that this is genetically primed. So, for example, Siri and colleagues have found that in the last 200,000 years, there have been changes in there's been a process that they call craniofacial feminization. So we now have a less pronounced eyebrow ridge than our ancestors 200,000 years ago, and we have a shallower sort of forehead, skull. And they believe that this is because there has been a down-regulation in all humans, male and female, of circulating male sex hormones, and that was favored by natural selection operating on genes because it made us less aggressive to one another. So evidence that genetic evolution has made us more socially tolerant. And what about social motivation? So social tolerance relates to how aggressive or otherwise we are with one another. Social motivation relates to how much we want to engage with other people. And there's evidence that humans are especially keen on something that's known as action contingent stimulation. We really like it when what happens in the outside world is controlled by, or is predicted by, our own actions. If, for example, a newborn baby, has a mobile lying over their cot, and you tie a ribbon between the baby's toe and the mobile, so that the mobile will move whenever their foot moves, the baby really loves that. That is response contingent stimulation. What the baby does predicts and controls what the mobile does. Now, in that particular example, the stimulation is coming from an inanimate source, a non-social source. But we are the primary source of action-contingent stimulation for each other. When I do something, you do something. That provides each of us with action-contingent stimulation. And there's reason to believe that we humans particularly like that. But going back to this theme of we simply have more of some things than other animals have, quantitative difference, we're certainly not the only animals that enjoy action-contingent stimulation. Let's take rats. This rather lovely study from some time ago showed that if you put your hand in the cage of a tame rat, and you move your hand only when the rat moves. You wait to see while it's still, your hand is still, but as soon as the rat moves, you move your hand. Doesn't matter what you do, as long as your hand movements are predicted and controlled by the rat's movements, the rat comes to really like your hand. It approaches and snuggles up to your hand. So this enjoyment of action-contingent stimulation is phylogenetically widespread, it's evolutionarily ancient, it's just stronger in us. And because we have that additional social motivation and that reduction in mutual aggression, we open floodgates to information from other people. So this young boy is able and motivated to watch a number of skilled individuals as they make and use tools. If this adult male was a chimpanzee, he probably wouldn't tolerate having juveniles nearby. It wouldn't be possible to get close enough to see what he was doing. He likely has the patience to go slowly, to emphasize the different stages of what he's doing, facilitating the learning by the juvenile. And the juvenile, because he's so motivated to get this action-contingent stimulation to engage with others, is happy to watch for extended periods. So these simple changes to social tolerance and social motivation lay the groundwork for lots of observational learning and teaching, enabling us as we grow up to load up knowledge and skills from adults, but also, I'm arguing, to build new cognitive mechanisms using the information that we get from adults. So that's our temperaments. What about attention? There is lots of evidence that while social tolerance and motivation gets us up close and personal to knowledgeable others, there are attentional biases that lock our attention onto those individuals from birth. I think some of the best evidence that we are biased to look at faces from birth comes from a study from Mark Johnson and his colleagues back in 1991, in which they showed newborn infants one of two configurations of blobs. The infant either saw an upright triangle of 3 black blobs on a light background, or an inverted triangle of 3 black blobs on a light background. This one is face-like, and this one is not face-like. And newborns will turn their heads to track the face-like stimulus for much longer than they will turn their heads to track the stimulus, which in terms of its low-level features is identical, but which is not face-like because the triangle is inverted. And in case any confirmation was needed that this face bias, this tendency to look intently at faces, does not depend on experience, that it's one of the things which is programmed in the genes, a recent, very striking study replicated it with fetuses in the 3rd trimester. So they projected these stimuli through the mother's uterus and measured how many head turns the fetus made towards the stimulus and they made more turns towards the face-like than the non-face-like stimulus. And this very early attentional bias, as you can tell from the simplicity of the stimuli, is a very simple thing. It's reflex-like in its simplicity, but it builds through learning into greater things which make the infant and then the child yet more receptive to information coming from others. So initially, the inborn thing is this blob bias. Very shortly, that becomes a preference specifically for human faces. At birth, that is a bias to monkey faces, human faces, doesn't matter. Before too long, it's specifically human faces. And then through exposure to human faces, through learning, that turns into, at about 4 months, gaze cueing. The baby has learned that if they track the turning of an adult's head, if the baby turns that way, where the adult's head moves that way, then they're more likely to see something interesting than if the baby turns that way, where the adult's head moves that way. Having learned that, of course, the baby's attention to the world is now being controlled by the adult. Whichever way the adult looks, the baby's attention will go there. And later still, the baby learns through general processes of learning that it's especially a good idea to track the gaze of an adult when the adult has just given you a cue, like making direct eye contact with you or calling your name. We would say those are the occasions on which the adult intends to teach you something by turning their head. The baby doesn't need to know that. The baby just needs to have detected that if it follows the gaze of an adult immediately after the adult has made eye contact, then it's more likely to see something interesting. So, cascading effects, again, making the infant more receptive to information from adults. And finally, central cognitive processes. There is evidence that several of these are expanded in humans, including working memory, there being a workspace in which you could hold several pieces of information simultaneously in mind in order to do things with them, an active form of short-term memory. There's plenty of evidence that even rats have working memory, but in humans, it's of a greater capacity. More pieces of information can be held in mind and worked with simultaneously. Similarly, inhibitory control, the kind of mental inhibitory control which allows us to resist the impulse of the moment in order to pursue longer-term goals, whether it's resisting eating that donut because I want to remain healthy, or resisting responding angrily to somebody else because one wants to maintain a good relationship with them in order to be able to work together. A recent study tested 500 species for inhibitory control and found evidence of it in all of them. But human inhibitory control seems to be particularly strong. And associative learning. Associative learning is a very simple form of learning in which excitatory and inhibitory links are formed between very simple representations of the world. It's the kind of learning that made Pavlov's dogs salivate to the sound of a bell when the bell had been rung before food was presented on a number of occasions. It's the kind of learning that makes rats press a lever in a conditioning chamber in order to get food. So it's a form of learning which is present in all vertebrate species and in a large number of invertebrate species. It's an evolutionarily ancient form of learning, but there's evidence that the capacity for associative learning has been greatly expanded by genetic evolution in primates and in particular in the human line. For example, this study compared pigeons with primate baboons, who are much more closely related to us, just looking at how many picture-action associations the animals could form, and found that the maximum capacity for pigeons was 1,200 picture-outcome relationships. Not bad. But the baboons, the primates, much more closely related to us, on the same training regime, learned more than 5,000 picture-outcome relationships. So an expansion of the capacity for associative learning, but also of the speed and of the degree to which associations can become linked to particular contexts. Now, it's been suspected for a long time that humans have an extraordinarily large capacity for associative learning. But most people thought, well, that couldn't help to explain why we lead such peculiar lives, why we have these distinctively human cognitive mechanisms, because it was thought that associative learning is just involved in the control of very simple behavior, in the control of spit and twitches, as it was often said. But recent research has shown that that picture was quite wrong. For example, Tim Behrens and Matthew Rushworth and their colleagues, using mathematical modeling of brain imaging data, have found that associative learning is fundamental to teaching. It's the same mechanisms of associative learning which are responsible for Pavlov's dog salivating at the sound of the bell, are involved in a teacher keeping track of her own actions and their outcomes, the actions of the pupil's experience of acting and what those outcomes have been, and keeping these two things separate, not getting them confused. The same principles of associative learning are involved when we are sifting advice. When we receive advice from others, it needs to be combined with what we believe on the basis of our own past experience. And combining those two sources of information involves the same associative principles. And another example, some research by my research group and others has suggested that one of the fruits of our expanded capacity for associative learning is what's known as the mirror neuron system. So mirror neurons are cells found in the premotor and parietal cortex of monkeys and also of humans that have a very interesting property. A mirror neuron will fire when the individual, in this case a monkey, performs an action, say for example picking up a grape with their thumb and forefinger using a precision grip, and the very same neuron will be active, it will fire, when the monkey observes somebody else, perhaps a human, using the same grip to pick up the grape, but not using a different grip. So one particular mirror neuron active when the monkey performs a precision grip, and when the monkey observes a precision grip, but not when the monkey observes a power grip, a whole hand grip. Now these very interesting neurons have been implicated in many cognitive functions, including action understanding, theory of mind, empathy, imitation, language, and malfunctioning of mirror neurons has been implicated in conditions such as autism and schizophrenia. And when they were first discovered, it was assumed that these mirror neurons were programmed in the genes, that the genes had arranged for us to have cells with these mirror perceptual motor properties. But my group and others have found evidence that instead these cells get their properties from associative learning. So insofar as the genes program anything, they program there to be some neurons which are motor neurons. These neurons are involved in the performance of actions. And other neurons which are visual neurons. They're involved in the detection of certain actions in the outside world. But when people, or monkeys, have experience in which they see and do the same action simultaneously, for example, if they watch themselves performing actions, then the motor neuron for performing that action will be active, and its activity will be correlated with those visual neurons which detect the sight of the same action. And that experience, by an associative Hebbian process, will result in the motor neuron getting wired up, having a strong connection with a visual neuron that's detecting the corresponding action. Consequently, what was once just a motor neuron now is a mirror neuron. It will fire not only when the action is performed, but when the same action is observed. Just to give you a flavor of the kind of evidence which suggests this, as Caroline Kattner found, it's known before our research on this, that if you observe index finger movements, an abduction movement of the index finger, it moves to the side, then by virtue of the action of the mirror neuron system, there will be activity, even if you're just passively observing this index finger movement. The muscles in your hand, which are responsible for index finger movement, will become active. Similarly, if you watch another person moving their little finger, then the muscles in your hand, which are responsible for little finger movement, will become active. You may not be aware of it, but it can be measured electrically, this activation of the corresponding muscle in the observer. And that occurs by virtue of the mirror neuron system. And what we did, led by Caroline Kattner, was to check that this was the case in the participants in our experiment. Then we gave them a little experience in which, while they were observing index finger movements, they were performing little finger movements. Similarly, while they were observing little finger movements performed by somebody else, they were performing index finger movements. We gave them what we called counter-mirror training. And after that counter-mirror training, we found that the relationships had reversed. Now, these people, when they were observing index finger movements, for example, it was the muscles controlling their little fingers that were active, and vice versa. So, supporting the idea that the mirror neuron system is built through associative learning, experiments like this show that it's extremely plastic, and it's extremely plastic on the basis of exactly the kind of experience that associative learning theory would predict. So, I'm not suggesting that we are blank slates at birth, or that our minds are exactly like those of chimpanzees. Instead, I think that genetic evolution has made quantitative changes and inflected our temperaments, our attention, and our multi-purpose processes of cognition. And that genetic starter kit makes us especially receptive to information from others as we grow up. And that information that flows in through social interaction with others not only gives us lots of knowledge of the world, lots of skills, but also enables the construction of new cognitive mechanisms which are honed by cultural evolution and that are found in us and not in any other animals, that are qualitatively different. Those mechanisms are what I'm calling cognitive gadgets. The Oxford English Dictionary defines a gadget as a comparatively small fitting or contrivance. Now, I chose the term gadget in part because of the sound of it. Two sort of spiky syllables in contrast with instinct. So in a way it sounds like instinct, but it means something very different. Whereas an instinct is something produced by the genes. I'm suggesting that distinctively human cognitive mechanisms are, like gadgets, produced by human action. I'll even embrace the comparatively small fitting, because the attentional mechanisms, the temperamental mechanisms, and the general purpose cognitive mechanisms that I've been talking about in the last 10 minutes, I think they are the big machines of behavior in us as in other animals. They do most of the heavy lifting, including the construction of the distinctively human cognitive mechanisms. But the things that we have in our minds that aren't in the minds of other animals are certainly the ones of which we are most proud, and the ones which give us our peculiar lives. So, next time I'll look at two specific gadgets, imitation and mind reading, and as Barry announced, if you can't make it to the next lecture, or even if you can, the whole story will shortly be published by Harvard University Press and is available for pre-order on Amazon. Thank you.